Welcome to Let the Boys Kiss, the creation of queer ships, where we ask the question, is it queer baiting, queer coding, or queer canon?
This week, we'll be discussing Will and Hannibal, otherwise known as Hannigram, or if you're feeling fun, Murder Husbands, from the NBC series Hannibal. I'm Maddie.
And I'm Kelsey. So I'm excited about this episode, Maddie. We're doing something a little bit different.
A little bit experimental.
Yeah. But who are we covering today? I know we always say at the top, but, just to orient ourselves.
Yeah, to get back into it. We are talking about Will Graham and Hannibal Lecter from the NBC series Hannibal, but more broadly from the series of novels, the films, Silence of the Lambs. You probably, if you haven't seen this show, you probably know Anthony Hopkins' Hannibal Lecter version. And to talk about what sources we will be discussing is where we get into the interest of this particular episode. So I'm a Hannibal fan. I've seen the series in full maybe just 2 times, I think, but I've seen it all the way through a couple of times, and then I've probably seen an episode here or there. What's your situation with Hannibal?
So I had not seen the show prior to us deciding to do this ship for the podcast. And so the experiment of this is you gave me a selection of episodes to watch to get a handle.
Selection.
Yes, on what the ship is. And so I think you gave me a total of 20 episodes to potentially watch. Some of them were like, you might just watch this clip or you could just read a recap of it. I ended up watching 14 episodes, and I think we'll post the list of what you suggested and what I actually watched. So it's not a super long show. It's only 39 episodes total. So it's not, I watched, an okay chunk of it, but yeah, that's my knowledge of it. And just for a little bit of more background coming into the show, are you otherwise familiar with Hannibal Lecter in the films and the books, or?
Yeah, I've seen Silence of the Lambs. I've seen Red Dragon, the Ed Norton movie, which is actually more that's closer to the source material for this, because that's the origin of Will Graham and that whole storyline. Though this television version exists sort of like out of time from the sequence of how the films have worked. So a lot of people I've seen people asking the question like, so it's now, but he's younger than Anthony Hopkins back in the day. And it's like, you just sort of have to roll with it.
They're different adaptations.
Right, exactly. It's the same guy, but it takes place at a different time. So whatever. And I don't think anyone's trying to argue that his Hannibal Lecter like grows up to become Anthony Hopkins' Hannibal Lecter. That feels outside what they were trying to do. So yeah, I would say I've seen a couple of the other films. I haven't read any of the books. And to be honest, it's been several years since I've watched either of those movies. What about you? Have you seen any of the other source material?
I have not. So I have not seen Silence of the Lambs or any of the subsequent movies or any of the other adaptations. So I, of course, am an adult human who grew up in America. So I'm familiar with the character.
Fairly culturally literate, I would say. So
yeah. So it's not like
him referenced.
Lecter, who's this guy? What's he up to? What could he be doing?
Yeah, I had you start watching the show and you were shocked to learn that he was a cannibal.
Oh my gosh. No. I don't know if it ends up being relevant coming into the show with like a deep knowledge of Hannibal lore or not, but I thought it was worth kind of just saying the full scope of our awareness of the character.
Sure. So I think how we are going to approach this one is different than how we have approached any other episode because of the unconventional. I think this is the first time that we had not seen that we had not both seen all of the material.
Yeah, so this is our first time doing it. So
right. So as a fun experiment, the plan I think is going to be, since it is an interesting task that I have laid on you to watch a selection of episodes and try to cobble together the understanding of not just these two characters and their ship, but also I would say what the hell's going on in the television series as you're watching it.
I'm excited for this experiment. I think it's going to be pretty fun. So Are you ready to hear what I think is happening with
Yeah,
the show?
I'm so excited. We've been keeping each other from talking about this so that we could discuss it for the podcast, and I need to know what you think just happened when you watched all of that.
Okay, so our two characters of interest. We have
Mhm.
Will Graham. He is not in the show, I think, explicitly magical, but he's basically magical. He's a
Yeah, but he's the sort of magical that you get with, like, you know, the guy who's the star of a detective show where he's like psych magical, or like the mentalist magical. Like, he is sort of has extra skills that people don't normally have, but he's not, performing magic
I would argue, I haven't seen
tricks.
The Mentalist, that Psych
No,
at
me
least
neither.
Psych at least brings you more through, because they do that thing where like they zoom in on the clue and then
Yeah,
they
yeah,
zoom
yeah.
out. Whereas he just seems to be like, this is my design, and we should talk a lot about this is my design, and then he just like
I only ever want to talk about this is my design.
walks through the
You're right.
murder. But anyway,
There
he's
is
like a forensic investigator, criminal
Mhm.
profiler, magic man. And then we have Hannibal Lecter, who is by profession a psychiatrist. But spoiler alert, he's also a serial killer and a cannibal. And
You'd never know. His name rhymes with cannibal, but no one would guess it.
oh, I did have a question for you, which
Yeah.
you might know because you have at least seen Silence of the Lambs and some of the other movies. Is there a history of Hannibal being considered a queer coded character because he's like such a fancy man?
I think yes. I think there's a tiny bit of this discussion later. I don't even remember if I clipped these quotes, but while I was doing the research into what both the actors and the creators say, Brian Fuller talks a little bit about not just Hannibal, but also Clarice Starling being sort of queer coded characters in Silence of the Lambs,
Okay.
which is a totally interesting, different dynamic when you're talking about a woman and a man both being queer coded characters, because you end up with a very different dynamic than what you've got going on in this show.
Yeah.
But I think that's not he's always been sort of like a dandy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Hannibal, they meet each other through the process of trying to track down the serial killer, blah, 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 whatever. And Hannibal seems to be a person who doesn't usually connect with other people. You know, he views them as meat. They're just animals to him, whatever. But something about Will really, really, catches his eye. And I think, like, throughout the show in different parts, it seems like he can't quite wrap his head around his feelings because they're so unusual. So he, like, doesn't know if he wants to be Will or he wants to consume Will or he wants to be with Will. Like, those seem to be the things he's trying.
Sometimes it's hard to read our own emotions,
For sure.
It can be very confusing.
So this isn't quite in order, but I guess it gets to other questions, right? So clearly the he wants to consume Will pops up a couple times. There's some parts of the show where he's kind of like explicitly almost about to consume Will. So he wants to be Will. As I'm watching the episode, one of the real questions I have is about the character of Alana. Because every time I come back into the show, she's like sleeping with a different psychopath. And I'm like, what's going on with you? Are you okay? What's happening?
She's one of those people that's just really drawn to psychopaths.
And it's like also like the world is very small. It's like you can't meet someone outside the scope of all this insanity. I don't know, whatever. So one thing I didn't understand right is I come into the episode in season 2 and all of a sudden she's sleeping with Hannibal when I left off she was with Will. Is his relationship with Alana in an effort to like be Will, like have the
It's all interestingly tied up in some weirdness for all of them, right?
Okay.
Did I give you the episode where they have the like dream threesome?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, I should have at least given you that scene. There's a scene where you're experiencing this basically through, Will has this very like active dreamy sequence life that other people are not experiencing. So there's a scene where he is sleeping with a different woman, and then Alana and Hannibal are sleeping together, and it becomes through like
I think I did see
sequence.
that. That's when he's sleeping with
For the Verger woman.
Yes, the girl who's in Supernatural, who's the what's her face.
So it becomes this like interesting threesome where it's like Hannibal on one side of Alana and Will on the other or whatever, and they're all together in the same bed, and you're like, what is going on here? Because there very much is an element all the way through of like they're all sort of weirdly obsessed with Will, and like Will is obsessed with Hannibal, but he also has these feelings for Alana, and then Hannibal and Alana both really want to be with Will, so they're being with each other in an effort to like it's the thing where like the only thing they have in common is Will. I mean, other than the fact they're both psychiatrists, like that's something in common.
Well,
but what's like the reason they're in each other's orbit is this Will relationship.
Okay.
And then there's like obviously she, and to a lesser extent he for her, is like a replacement for Will. So yeah, there's definitely weirdness of it being sort of an emotional threesome in all sorts of various ways.
All right. So, and then of course he wants to be with Will, right? They're going to run away together at the end of season 2.
So sweet.
But of course it doesn't quite work out.
Because Will betrays him.
Yeah. Yes. Halfway through season 3, right, is when he gives himself up and he's like, you know where to find me. You'll come back to me. I'm not worried about it.
What a move. What a crazy, weird power move for Will to be like, let's just never see each other again. And Hannibal's like, you know why you'll have to see me? Is if I turn myself in, and then you'll always know where I am.
Right.
Bizarre.
So, you know, Hannibal's slowly working on Will throughout the first couple seasons to like get him to really, I guess, see if they are similar people, if he's someone he can relate to. So he's trying to get him to murder people, but also like enjoy the sensuality of it, right? So that's clearly a theme running through this show of like intense sensuality, both of like the food and then like the physicality of the murders. And I think, you know, it's very clear that Hannibal is pretty preoccupied with Will. There's a scene, I think in season 2, where he's talking to his therapist.
Hannibal's therapist?
Yeah, Hannibal's therapist.
Bedelia de Maurier, who's Gillian Anderson.
They're talking about Will, because they're always talking about Will.
When are they not talking about Will?
And she's like, oh, you keep going back to him. What's going on? He says to her, I miss him. And she goes, you're obsessed. And he goes, I'm intrigued. And it's like, I don't know.
It's a little bit more than intrigued.
But then I think, right, you can ask the question, is this just like Hannibal's obsessed with Will, or is it reciprocated? So there's a bunch of interesting things I think that happen through the show. And one of the early parts that I also had a question with Alana is in season 1, Will and Alana kiss for the first time in his cabin. And then Will immediately goes to Hannibal's house and is like, I kissed Alana.
I'm obsessed with that moment. What a weird thing to do.
So what I didn't understand about that is, was Hannibal encouraging their relationship? Like, what was the dynamic of Hannibal's understanding of Will's burgeoning relationship with Alana? Because it seems very strange to me that he would be like, I kissed a girl. Oh my God, I got to go drive to Baltimore.
No, but
tell my
that
friend.
really is how it feels. Like, he's not encouraging him to get with Alana. I don't even really, they talk about her a little bit, but it's not a thing. Like, when you're watching it in sequence and he drives to Hannibal's house to say, oh my God, I kissed Alana, you're like, why did you just drive to Hannibal's house to tell him that you kissed Alana? Okay. Like, it's the weirdness of it is intentional.
So I did not miss something. I was just like, why did that?
No, it's like an early sign of how invested he is in Hannibal's opinions about himself, I guess.
Yeah.
You know, like the first thing he thinks to do once that happens is to drive to Baltimore. We haven't talked about this, by the way. Him living in Wolf Trap, Virginia, and Hannibal living in Baltimore, which has to be a 2-hour drive. At least.
Here's the thing. So, for background for the listener, we have both lived in and around the DC area for various lengths of time. If you're going to someone's house in Baltimore for dinner and you're leaving from Northern Virginia, it's going to take you 3 hours to get there.
Man. At rush hour? And he's doing that all the time, just like popping in to Baltimore to visit Hannibal. I think there's the time when Hannibal has a dinner party and Will drives there before the dinner party to tell him he can't come. He like leaves him a gift or something, and is like, sorry, I can't be here for the dinner. And it's
Yeah.
like, you have already driven hours.
You might as well stay because it's going to, again, if it's dinner time, you might as well stay because if you wait later, it'll be faster to drive back. You're going to get home at the same time, guy.
Uh-huh. But anyway, leaving that aside, yes, him showing up there and saying, like, I have feelings about a thing I just did with Alana is like, you're thinking, God, Will, what is your relationship with Hannibal coming to? Like, this is getting really weird.
Really strange. Okay. That's interesting to know that it was also strange if you've been viewing the show all the way through. So, of course, Will does start to get into murder at first. Sure. Like,
once you dabble, hard to get out.
It is. And so one of the episodes that you had recommended to me, I think you didn't have me watch the whole episode where Hannibal sends someone to kiss. Hannibal sends someone to kill.
Imagine if Hannibal sent someone to kiss Will. To like grab him and kiss him and then be like, that's from Hannibal.
That would be different too. So yes, Hannibal sends someone to kill Will, and I watched that, and that's like when Will like really gets into murder, and he like tears that guy apart in, again, a very sort of like, you know, sensual way, like using that definition very literally. And that, of course, we also found that great meme of that scene where they then come and look at the body that he's torn apart.
I hopefully people who are listening to this have seen the show, but if not, the Hannibal kind of like as a gift. It's a whole courting process that's happening in that season. He sends a murderer after Will, and then Will kills the guy and brings the body to Hannibal as like I think in his mind he's trying to be like, look what you made me do or something, but it's like Hannibal reads it as like, oh, my beautiful pupil has finally like come into his own. And then various things are happening, but they're making it seem like this guy was murdered by himself, basically. I think is what they're doing. Like the serial killer that's been acting is this guy, and so they display his body in the manner that he normally would to pretend that he's another victim. And so the two of them are running down the case with the cops and talking about it in a way where like it would be obvious to anyone that they were the murderers because they're so proud of everything that has happened and they won't stop talking about it. And it's like this weird flirtation and bragging all in one scene.
So he eventually kills someone, and I guess within the show, right, there's some tension about how much Will is actually into all this and how much he's just doing it to to capture Hannibal.
You mean like in the narrative, or the other people have tension about it?
I think in the narrative, my impression was
so like watching it, there's tension. Yeah,
as the viewer, you're not sure where Will is going to end up.
Right, because in my mind, part of that is that it doesn't seem like Will is sure.
Right.
Through a lot of, like, he's hiding things from us, certainly, but also there are moments where it feels like he hasn't made up his mind about if he's going to be, I think he enters into it probably with the intention of turning in Hannibal, but like the further he gets into Hannibal's world, the less and less sure that he'll be able to go through with it.
So we get to the end of season 2. Will has decided not to go with Hannibal, sort of.
Well, yeah, that culmination of season 2 is a very dramatic and hugely like consequential moment for the two of them.
Yeah.
Because it's seemingly at the last minute, Hannibal has asked him to run away together, which he could have done and he doesn't. But the plan on Hannibal's end is that they're going to invite Jack over for dinner and kill him, and then it'll all be fine. So Will ends up trying to take this middle ground where Jack has found out who Hannibal is. He doesn't want Hannibal to get caught. So he calls Hannibal and tells him to run, but he's not going to go with him. And so then, of course, that doesn't work because Hannibal wants them to run together. And so Jack shows up, he fights with Hannibal, and then finally Will shows up, and Hannibal is heartbroken that Will has betrayed him. Because that's been the thing in the whole lead up to this finale is like, Hannibal keeps having conversations with him like, you're really on my side, right? It's you and me against Jack. We're together on this. And Will keeps having conversations with Jack that are like, we're together on this, right? We're going to take down Hannibal. And Will just keeps like yesing everyone.
In a way where confrontation.
Right. And so I think he's in the end, he tries to do this path of least resistance where he cares about Hannibal and doesn't want him to be in trouble, but he also can't take the dive into like being the type of person that would run away with Hannibal.
The dive, you say.
Spoilers.
So we get to season 3. Hannibal's fled to Europe. Will goes to Europe to get Hannibal. They end up finding him, and then they come back to the States together. That's when Hannibal ends up turning himself in, because Will's like, get out of here. I don't love you anymore. Get on, go.
Yeah, shoo! Get out of here!
I think he anticipates that Hannibal will run off again and
well, because he is a serial killer on the run that you would assume would want to go be in hiding.
But instead, to spite him, Hannibal turns himself in, and he's like, you know where to find me.
Yeah.
You.
And so then this second half of the 3rd season.
Yeah, we flash forward a substantial amount of time.
I think it's like 5 years.
Yeah. Hannibal's in jail. Will no longer magic. He's like, I can't do it anymore, Jack.
Well, he's still magic. He just doesn't want to do it anymore. Like,
it's all tied into Hannibal.
Right.
But Jack brings him back in to solve another crime.
Well, and he's been off building a new family. He has a new wife who has a son. He's like trying to live a happy domestic life.
And of course, he eventually has to consult Hannibal.
Yeah.
And so they end up, he falls back in. And then towards the end, he's in therapy, or he's talking. I don't know if he's in therapy, or he's talking with Gillian Anderson, and he says to her, is Hannibal in love with me? And you're like...
And it's like, you're an idiot.
Yeah, I think so. Everyone here's a psychiatrist, but like, you can't see that this dude is...
Yeah, but Bedelia does say, like, in her own weird Hannibal dialogue way, yes, he is. But she says, does he ache for you or something? And I don't know, it's like super flowery.
Yeah.
But yeah, moral of the story, she's like, obviously, yes.
Oh, here's another question that I had. Before all this happens, I think this is also season 2 where we're not sure like what's going on with Will, and there's the journalist who's
Freddie Lowndes.
It's the episode, I think, where he kills her, quote unquote kills her.
Right.
And he mentions that she referred to them as murder husbands. Does that originate in the show, or did that originate in the fandom and then come back into the show?
I didn't watch it when it was on.
Oh, okay.
I think it originates in the show, but I would love it if they just took that from the fandom and put it in. Okay. I think that's probably part of the reason that there are 2 names for them. I assume Hannigram is the fan-invented version, and then the show called them Murder Husbands. And everyone was like, oh, that's delightful.
Yeah, okay.
We should probably say that too. But that's a good question. I don't know.
So then in the season or series finale, who can say?
Hopefully not. Potentially more to come.
Will's like, I'm going to pretend to break Hannibal out from prison, and we're going to, find the guy.
Well, he doesn't pretend to break him out. He pretends that he needs him to find the serial killer.
Yeah, he does.
So he does get him out. Yeah. He really gets out of prison, but it's with the help of the FBI.
So at the end, he and Hannibal murder the Red Dragon together, and it's
the culmination of everything Hannibal's been trying to achieve.
Again, like very sensual, and like it's all these like beautifully lit shots. They're at like this remote house on the ocean.
I think it's a house of Hannibal's. I think he has lots of like things that he owns, property and such.
Right. So they're on like a rocky bluff in this beautiful modern glass house, and they, beautifully murder the serial killer. And then at the end, they're sitting on the edge of the bluffs together.
They're standing on the edge of the cliff, yeah.
And they embrace, and like Will leans into Hannibal, and then presumably Will pulls Hannibal off the cliffs into the ocean.
Mm-hmm. I think what happens, they're clutching each other, and Hannibal basically says, like, this is all I ever wanted for us. Yeah. And Will says, it's beautiful.
It's very
and then
tender.
He grabs, he gently grabs Hannibal, and he just sort of, like, leans them off the cliff, and they fall, presumably to their deaths, but not really, because everyone's trying to make there be another season.
So, that's kind of the relationship. I think you answered all my questions. That was my understanding of
I think that you understood most of it pretty well. There are like side characters that have more important plots that ended up being kind of written out by my
sure.
selection. Um, but yeah, I think I feel proud of myself. You've understood most of what's going on with the two of
We
them.
got a pretty good bar for this format of
Yeah,
figuring out the
I
chat.
can't wait to do it again. So then I guess let's dig into some of what the creators, actors, writers, etc., are saying about the show and the ship and that sort of thing. Because this is an interesting case, I think, where I don't know that Brian Fuller, when he started writing this, set out to make it a queer romance. I don't think that was necessarily his plan. And that sort of comes through. When you're watching the first season, it's very much just like kind of a procedural, like a weird procedural. The characters are odd and there's strange, they talk funny and that sort of thing. But it's
way
like
more slow-mo.
Yeah, the episodes are very case of the week in a way that they are not as you get later. And it's sort of just like is the NBC version of this show, which is what you would expect. And then it's sort of just like it took on a life of its own, not just with the fans, but I think there's a thing that happens where actors have special chemistry and it sort of just like is what it is. And you can try to write away from it, but you can also embrace it. So yeah, let's start, I guess, with actors, because the person who has the most to say about all of this is Brian Fuller, so I want to save him for the end. So let's start with Hugh Dancy, who plays Will Graham. He might be the one who talks like the least about the active romance of the two of them. He definitely thinks they have a deep connection. He usually phrases it more in like they have like a mental connection more than an emotional one, I guess, is a kind of a way to say it. But here are some of his quotes. He says, "The headspace is so abstract in terms of where he is in relation to Hannibal at any given time. Do they love each other? Do they hate each other? Are they just pretending? Does he know that I know that he knows? Is it a game? Is it another game?" He does say, though, must be from like in an interview between seasons 2 and 3. Okay. He says, "When season 3 picks up, we're both pining for each other. What I found is that when people start talking about the show on set, trying to work out a scene, pretty soon everyone starts talking about the worst relationship they were ever in. It's a love story, but obviously not a very functional one." And then this I just thought was sweet. They did this summer when they released it on Netflix, they did a cast reunion interview thing. So there are a lot of quotes from this year about this sort of stuff. Hugh says about their relationship, "Mutual recognition is a big part of it. It's two people who have been, if not lonely, completely unique their whole lives, and then somebody comes along who, in Hannibal's case, it's conscious. He sees this rare thing in Will. Will perhaps recognizes in Hannibal his greatest secret, and that's a very powerful thing. I always thought of it as if you're not only a great chess player, but you're the only person who ever plays chess, and then one day someone else walks in with a chessboard and your whole world changes." So I think in his mind, they definitely have this like special connection that with no one else on Earth. But I didn't get a lot from him about like whether or not he thinks they're in love. Okay. So that he's got his own opinions about that. I don't know. Mads Mikkelsen, who's our Hannibal Lecter, went on a little bit more of a journey in his comments, because I found some earlier ones from like when the first season was out, and then how he talks about it as time goes on. So in season 1 sort of interviews, he does say, he like refers to it as a bromance, which I think is a thing Brian Fuller would do in the first season as well. Okay. And so he talks about Hannibal loving him, but it's not hugely like romantic. So he's talking about first how Will is full of empathy and he can't control it, and Hannibal also has the power to like use empathy as a tool. And so he says, yes, Hannibal loves him and he will go far to help him, but if it's the help Will needs, I'm not sure. And then he also says, it's a bromance, as Brian Fuller says. I'm attracted to Will in the sense that I see a young man with great potential, maybe greater potential than I had when I was a kid. So therefore I'm fascinated with him and I really have true feelings for him. So that's sort of the baseline of what they were saying about them when they were making season 1. But he has sort of a different opinion as we get to like season 3 interviews. So yeah, somebody asked him, it wasn't difficult to see the love story aspect of the Hannibal and Will relationship earlier, but it was interesting to see it get more direct in the final episodes. Will himself asks, is Hannibal in love with me? And the subtext somewhat becomes the text at that point. And so Mad says, well, it's always been a part of the show. It's been a bromance since the very beginning in my eyes. There's no doubt that the second that Hannibal lays his eyes on Will's for the first time, he fell in love. Not necessarily in a physical way, but in a bonding way. So it's always been part of our show since the beginning, and whether people interpret that as a homoerotic thing that never really gets to be lived out, or whether they interpret it simply as an emotional connection between two people, that's up to the audience. For us, it wasn't that interesting or vital to get specific, but it does go between mental and physical closeness in the last couple of episodes. That's true. He also says from around that time, I recently watched the whole second season back to back, and I was really impressed by how what is basically a horror show becomes a romance. Yes, it's platonic, but the further we've gone, the more graphic and symbolic it's become. He broke my heart, so I stabbed him with a knife in the stomach. So I think, yeah, he's still all along this path coming up with his own ideas about like how to characterize their relationship. So that's an interesting journey to track. Interesting. There are a lot of interesting comments from him about the end of season 2, which I always see as so pivotal to their relationship. Somebody asked him if he was really crying in the season 2 finale scene when he stabbed Will and like
if
there's
the
shot
character
of him crying.
is really crying, or if Mads and Will's in it.
I guess the character. I wasn't there for this question, but he says, Will Graham is the dearest thing I have. Will Graham to Hannibal is the thing in life that he has loved the most. And unfortunately, he didn't go down the path I want him to go down, so I have to finish the story right there, and it breaks his heart. So Hannibal is actually really sad. So yeah, he is not. Once we get to Brian Fuller, you'll see like Brian Fuller is more explicit about his opinions about these things, which is fair since he's the one writing them. But he does talk about how like clearly there's love there, and he interestingly does that thing of like, I don't know how much it helps me really to talk about whether or not they want to have sex with each other, because that feels like not really an important part of this discussion. And I agree with him there. Once everyone involved has acknowledged that like the characters are in love or whatever, does it matter when we try to get into the sexuality discussions? I don't know, probably not as much. And then just the last actor I'll talk about, Scott Thompson, who plays Jimmy Price, one of the lab rat guys. Okay, you probably have seen him in other things before. He said what I think we're all really thinking about the show. He says, one of the things I find really weird about this show, I mean, the show's got its own logic, its own world, it operates under its own rules, but like the homoerotic tension between Will and Hannibal is crazy. But no one ever says like, would you guys fuck already? Like, no one ever says, I think Hannibal's interest is a little gay. It's never said. Like, even Jack, who you would expect would go, what the fuck's going on? I mean, what's he want with you? You know what I mean? And I find that great because you definitely are watching the show, especially in later seasons. Like, when we're talking about after season 2 has happened, and Hannibal, like Will has tried to help Hannibal escape. All of this shit has gone down. There's a scene in early season 3 when Jack asks Will why he did it, and Will basically is like, he's my friend, and I didn't want him, like I wanted to leave with him, is what he says to Jack. All of that has happened, and then still by the end of season 3, Jack is like, sure, Will, go ahead and let Hannibal out of jail, because I'm sure that you're on my, like, side and will want to take care of him in the way that I am planning. Like, it's madness. Yeah. How does he never say anything about it? It kind of is hilarious.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because the show is so dramatic, right? Like, so I don't know if like within the universe is like, this is just the normal way people talk and interact, and just being so dramatic. So we don't notice because it's just like everyone's just so dramatic all the time.
I guess. I mean, it's hard to deny their connection. So that brings us to our creator, Brian Fuller, who is the one who went on a very interesting journey, I think, in writing the show from, where he started with his idea to write it and basically just be true to the characters in the book, who obviously are not in a relationship together, and I think don't really interact as much as they do in this. I'm pretty
Okay.
sure in the book, at least this is what happens in the movie, I don't think they really know each other for very long before Hannibal is in prison. Like, I don't think that there's this long build-up period of them, like, having a friendship and a working relationship, and then finally it gets discovered that Hannibal's guilty. Because it seems like most of the movie that I saw is Hannibal's in jail and he's helping them
Okay.
find the Red Dragon, right? So, like, I think that there's not a closeness between those characters in the way that there became a closeness in the series. So, yeah, here it's just a quote that I was telling you about before, where there is sort of a queerness to the characters as written, especially Hannibal and Clarice in Silence of the Lambs. But he says there's something in the work between Graham and Hannibal Lecter in the television series where it was already kind of embracing a strange queerness that made it more plausible for some viewers to buy the burgeoning romance between them, more so than they did with Clarice Starling and Hannibal in the novel. So then people ask him, do you see an actual sexual attraction between Will and Hannibal? This is the question on everyone's mind.
Mm-hmm.
So he says, I think there's a sexual attraction for Hannibal to Will. I think of Hannibal in two ways, one as a man and one as the devil. This will come back later. This apparently is something that Mads brought to the role. And so when we were breaking stories, both things had to be true. Like, this had to be true for the devil, and this had to be true if Hannibal was just a man in order for things to proceed narratively. And if we took licenses, like, how did Hannibal get in there? Well, if he's the devil, he turned to smoke and seeped under the door. And if he's a man, maybe he picked a lock. What was fascinating as the storytelling evolved and the actors inhabited their roles more fully, there became a fluidity and authenticity to the attraction that on Will Graham's side was sort of puzzling, but a slippery slope that he could slide down. And for Hannibal's side, it was, there's this man who can understand me in a way that no other human being can, and therefore I don't feel as lonely, and it's very easy to eroticize those feelings from a sexually fluid point of view. So I would say from Hannibal's perspective, there's a physical attraction as well as an intellectual attraction and emotional attraction, because Will Graham, in many ways, for the devil, represents the beauty of corruptibility of the pure spirit. And I think that was part of the attraction for Hannibal, is to transform Will, to inform Will's own becoming into a higher level being than just a plain old man. And for Will, I think there was this attraction to somebody who also saw him in a way that no one else saw. Whether that could ultimately become willingly sexual became much grayer territory than I originally thought it was going to be. So he's saying, like, there's some wiggle room there. We'll see where things go. And then to expand on the devil thing, this is a Mads Mikkelsen invention. In our very first meeting with Mads, he said, I really see this character as the devil. And that was a light bulb going off for me, because I was like, oh, that's such an interesting, epic, mythological take on the character. Not just to boil him down to a madman, but to give him a sense of mythology that really goes to the heart of why the devil is attracted to mankind. And it was a layer I thought about in only the loosest terms, but having Mads step into the kind of eternal wisdom of the devil, as opposed to the experiential wisdom of an aristocrat, felt like it gave the character a new awareness, at least for me, and a kind of dawning queerness in the story, because I feel like the devil is pansexual and therefore queer, and that's something that is more welcoming than sort of straight missionary-style sexuality. And then we have some quotes from this year talking about, like, maybe a season 4, which is sort of the running theme of all discussions with Brian Fuller and with the cast. People really want to do this season 4. So yeah, he was talking about the devil's pansexual, so obviously that's what's going on with Mads. I think Will Graham is a heterosexual character, but sexuality is fluid, and I think it would have to be a conversation where we would sit down to try to find the most authentic expression of their relationship now. So there's a lot of that. There's a lot of, like, he probably in his own mind is straight, but this obsession and like connection he has with Hannibal means there are more doors are open than would initially have been the case. Fuller said that one scene that will inform where the characters go is a telling moment in the penultimate episode of the final season, where Will asks Dr. Bedelia du Maurier, is Hannibal in love with me? Fuller says, up until the point where I wrote that scene, I was aware of the fan community wanting a sexualization between the characters, and I was entertained by that greatly, and got a kick out of it certainly, but I was also trying to be true to Thomas Harris, the author behind the source material, and these characters, and Mads' declaration of Hannibal as the devil. It's something I'm definitely interested in, and it feels like we were on a trajectory. We just have to find the most authentic path for that trajectory. And then talking specifically about season 4, he says, because of the nature of what would be happening in season 4, in terms of the grander manipulations that Hannibal has on Will Graham's mind. I don't think Hannibal would want to have sex with Will if Will wasn't in his right mind, and Will won't be in his right mind at season 4. So
Okay.
that's a little bit of a teaser.
Well,
interesting, though, that he has this idea of, like, Hannibal being someone who cares a lot about consent.
Yeah. So here's a question. Oh, I don't know. Do you have other?
I have more, but break in.
Okay. So we talked in the Harry Potter episode, right, about how problematic it was with Grindelwald and Dumbledore, that, like, J.K. Rowling was conflating, like, he turned to fascism and was also gay, and then he stopped being gay.
Oh my God, there was a lot going on there. Yeah.
Is there something, though, similar happening here with, like, he's drawing him away from heterosexuality, but also into murder and evil, and, like, you know, there's a whole history of, like, queer coding villains.
Yeah. I mean, there definitely is, like, something to that. I understand that reading. I think what's interesting to me, you're right that it's, like, part of Will's, I guess, descent into his worst urges includes this attraction to a male character. I think the flip side of it, to me, that's interesting is that, like, the queerness of the villain character is what humanizes him in this case. Like, I feel like the thing that makes Hannibal, relatable is not really the word, but, like, feel like someone you can care about is the way that he cares about Will. Okay. So, I mean, absolutely, you're right that there's, like, a long history of that. There's complication to it. There's definitely an element of, like, is Will's queering a part of his, you know, the manipulation of his soul into darkness or something. But
right, because it fit into this problematic narrative of, like,
you're right, it's impossible to escape that connotation when there have been so many, like, queer coded villains throughout the history of storytelling. But I do feel like most of the time that's an element of their character that's supposed to make them seem like a villain. You know? Like, it feels like part of when you're watching the character, you're like, oh, he's so creepy because he's hitting on that guy or something, you know? And it's like, that at least doesn't seem to be a part of this to me, but it's definitely worth interrogating. Part of what to take into account here is that Brian Fuller himself is gay. So that's its own layer of interest for what's going on with these two. So yeah, there's a lot to...
I don't have a particular feeling about it one way or the other, because I think, you know, every situation is different, and part of the reason that the J.K. Rowling situation is so problematic is because she just, like, decided in an instant. She didn't really think about it, and it's just so, like, flippant.
And then she dug her heels in.
Yeah. So I just, you know, thinking through the examples we've gone through and sort of...
Yeah. Well, and part of it too, I think, I've said this to you before when I was telling you about the show. I really view it as, like, a gothic romance, like the way that people who haven't seen it and hear about it, I think, are apt to be like, how can you watch a show that's about, like, a cannibal serial killer and enjoy it? Like, it seems so dark and whatever. And I just feel like if you think of Hannibal as, like, Dracula, you get more out of it than if you think of him as a serial killer the way that you see serial killers in other media. Because you're right, it's the entire thing is about, like, sensuousness and that sort of, like, our urges and our deepest drives and all of that. And it's, you know, it's like he wants Will to be the truest expression of his own desires.
Right. And that's there's, like, a lot of back and forth about, like, humans and animals and, you know, our animal nature and whatnot.
Sure.
And I maintain Will is magical. I think this is a supernatural show, just not explicitly.
Or it's, like, low level supernatural.
Okay, I didn't want to interrupt you for too long. It was just a question.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I'm most of the way through, but I have to comment on a particularly delightful article called "Brian Fuller is Pure Hannigram Trash." Okay. That has been written by Natasha Nicholson for Film Daily. She has put together a compendium of Brian Fuller, like, comments on Hannigram through the years. So she talks about how at the beginning, of the like first season, he starts talking about how it's really about a friendship. If you take out all the cannibalism and everything like that, you can just chart a male friendship. As a gay guy, I'm fascinated with straight male friendships. And it's like, that's kind of an interesting thing to say about a show that's not what you're writing. That's clearly not what you're writing. When every other comment you at least are telling me that Hannibal is pansexual, right? Like
Right,
it's
yeah.
not a straight male friendship. So then she starts to dig into more
It's
things he
also
said.
like not a normal friendship.
Right. It's not, I mean, it's like not a friendship. It's like a deep codependent obsession,
Yeah.
whether or not it's romantic or sexual. Um, so then, yeah, about season 1, he starts to say Hannibal's absolutely on a journey of self-exploration, and he's fascinated by his fascination with Will. He's curious about this change that's come over him. It's sort of like somebody who's falling in love for the first time. Maybe his ultimate downfall is his attraction and affection for Will Graham. And then he starts talking about how it happened. The journey of Hannigram happened organically. It naturally evolved because I guess I was absorbing so much of Mads and Hugh's performance, which felt like it was growing in intimacy, and it would have been inauthentic not to address it. That is how it feels watching the show. And then in season 3, they do officially say that Hannibal is in love with Will in the script, and so Brian Fuller says it felt like we had to shit or get off the pot ultimately because there had been so much going on between these two men. It's very much about death and the romance. Um, he says, I've never seen Hannibal as a crime story so much as a romantic horror story. This is a love story between a full-fledged psychopath and someone who has nascent psychopathic abilities. It's a love relationship between two men. One of them is a cannibal, and one of them understands those cannibalistic instincts all too well. In the final episode, Will and Reba, who's the woman, I don't know if any of this made it into your viewing, but the like blind woman that's been hanging out with the red dragon.
Yes, I did see that.
That Will and that woman have a moment that Brian Fuller describes as a quiet moment between the two people who were in love with serial killers. He says there's a quality to Will and Hannibal's connections that go above and beyond sexuality. You can have this intimate connection with somebody that then causes you to wonder where the lines of your own sexuality are. And we didn't quite broach the sexuality. It was certainly suggested, but the love is absolutely on the table. I feel one is omnisexual and one is heterosexual, and there's a lot of influence going back and forth. Who knows with a 6-pack of beer what could happen? So this is getting into some stuff that we have explored in various other conversations. It's harkening back to a lot of people. Like, there's always that bit of resistance when I hear people start to say, like, it's beyond sexuality, because
Right.
then you start to worry about that sort of, like, are you trying to ignore the sexuality element of it? But really, I find, just in my own readings of his stuff, that I find it fall more on, like, a Neil Gaiman-y sort of part of the spectrum, where he's saying, like, maybe they're asexual, maybe one of them is, maybe they're like having sex, maybe they're not, maybe you can read it however you want, but I am saying to you, like, they're in love. That's definitely the story I'm telling, which I know is not satisfying to a lot of people, but I think does leave open a lot of room for people to have their own interpretations of what's going on, um, specifically with the characters, and certainly leaves big windows for people to write fan fiction.
Yeah. I wonder if, right, the difficulty though with this show is because it is so explicitly sensual, then to not make also explicit like the sensual elements of their
Sure.
relationship is a little different, I think, maybe too, from like the Neil Gaiman example, where that's not like a super sexy
Well, yeah,
sexual.
nobody was like, why didn't they show the graphic sex in Good Omens?
Right. So I wonder if like that's also different and maybe a little bit difficult of this example of not showing them
Yeah.
expressing in such a sensual
Well, I also am
environment.
intrigued by the way that he has talked about the potential season 4,
Hmm.
where he's like, they probably won't have sex, but that's really only because Will's not going to be in his right mind.
Yeah.
um, so the last I have is just a couple of fun little things. He also, like Mads, probably more than Mads, engages in a lot of discussion with fans on Twitter, at conventions, all of that. And he really likes to do his own little fun Hannigram thing. So he like took a picture of himself drinking from this mug that has a picture of Hannibal or Hannigram on it, and it says "My ship is canon," and he's like drinking about how happy he is that his ship is canon. Has a lot of various Hannigram fan art. There's a picture of him here with wearing a shirt of Will and Hannibal kissing. That's fan art someone had made. There's somebody asked him a question on Twitter about in the finale when they go up to the beautiful house on the bluffs. They get there and it's like the sun's up and then all of a sudden the sun's down when they're getting attacked by a red dragon, and someone was like, what happened in the intervening period, this time gap? And he just replied to them, well, they did change clothes. And then there's another point where somebody is talking about it was like somebody had mentioned how Hannigram is real, then somebody else had said, can you believe there are people out here still questioning that whether or not Hannigram is canon? And he replied, climate change is real and so is Hannigram. Okay. So he definitely in like his social media life is a lot more loose about saying like they're together, y'all, which is an interesting difference in when he's giving an interview to the Rolling Stone or whatever, and when he's interacting directly with fans, there is sort of a different way that people speak about these things. But that's what I got for you from our cast and our Brian
it seems
Fuller.
right, generally supportive.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's denying the realness, the canonness of Hannigram. It's just an interesting journey that he went on from the beginning of how he was conceptualizing writing the show to where he has ended up. But sometimes you just gotta let the actors take you away.
Right. And I think we've talked about that before too, of like, it's much more common in writing straight relationships in shows that as the writer is going through the process of writing the show, of being like, oh, these characters are in love, fine, then they'll be in love and I'll write it into the show because the actors have chemistry and this is how that's developing.
Yep.
And less common for that to happen with same-sex relationships, even if the actors have the most chemistry. This is potentially an example of him being like, yes, I recognize it and it's a thing. Yeah, I wonder in this, because we talked again with like the Harry Potter example of like, it's a kid's movie, so like of course they're not like having sex. Yeah. But I wonder in this instance if it is, well, we'll get to it at the end of like, is it queer coded, queer baiting, whatever, for him to be so supportive, but them never show anything physical between them in a show that is so physical.
Well, we also, I will say, we have the issue of it being a broadcast television show in its first 3 seasons, and then if they get a season 4, that may no longer be the case.
Right.
Especially since their 3 seasons are airing on Netflix now, so Netflix seemingly would be like a great home for a 4th season.
Yeah.
In which you could do anything you want. So yeah, you're right. The proof may end up being in the pudding there.
All right. Well, we've done the creators. What are the fans up to?
Let's talk about some fan works. Interestingly, on AO3, this Hannigram ship in 2020 is the 24th most popular ship. They have about 19. Yeah, especially for a show that feels pretty niche. A little more than 19,000 works. And unlike any other ship that we have encountered so far, the most kudos fic is not a couple thousand words of a fluffy little fun story that anybody could read. It is a near 300,000 word fic that is basically a season 4 fix it. Like someone has decided the ending should not be the ending, and they have written the entire 4th season of the show. It's called The Shape of Me Will Always Be You by Miss Disoriental, and the description is basically just like they jumped off the cliff, Hannibal's vanished, Will's pining, and unexplained events will help Will realize Hannibal's closer than he dared hope for. So obviously neither you nor I read it. It's very, very long. We didn't have the time. But I am fascinated at this being the most popular fic in the fandom.
It's so long. But it wasn't just that one, right? You had to scroll through several
the
fics
top,
to get
like,
to one.
6 works of fan fiction are tens of thousands of words. Not all as long as this one, but there's not a short little fic in the top several.
Right. And so that's really different from what we've seen. And I think it's just gonna, like, I don't think we have any conclusions about it
No,
necessarily at
but
the
that is
moment.
an interesting difference from what we've been seeing so far.
And it'll be interesting to see if we see this again and if we can draw any conclusions at this point, or if this is just going to be a fun anomaly for us to be like, what's going on there?
Yeah.
Oh boy. 300,000 words. That's so many words.
Yeah. So just to get a taste, we did read what was the most popular short fic that we can find, which was called La Maison Rouge by Randstad. And you read it along with me because
I did.
you're dipping your toe into the fan fiction world now. So tell me your thoughts.
So I think not only do we have the case of like the first several fics are really long, but by and large, the most kudos fic that we've read has been like just a cute little fluffy story. And this one was quite sexually explicit, which I think is a little bit different.
Yes, eventually. It wasn't like just smut, which it could have been.
No, I'm just saying it's another different. So like, you know, it was short.
Yeah,
Fine,
it's just a couple dozen words. The premise of it is Hannibal starts inserting himself into Will's life by just showing up at his house and cooking him breakfast. And yeah. Will is sort of like, why is this happening? But then Hannibal's interested in Will, and Will sort of doesn't tell him to leave. And then, you know, that's sort of the whole thing.
So just a number of interesting differences in the most popular fic within this.
Very much so.
So we'll continue to keep an eye on what's going on with popular fic across different fandoms.
And then I don't think we have too much scholarly work to dig into here, but there is something that we wanted to talk about that seemed kind of interesting and relevant.
Yeah, so we didn't find anything super specific necessarily to the Hannibal fandom, but one thing I came across, and I couldn't get access to this paper, my licenses failed me this week, was this concept of post-object fandom. So we've talked through, right, sort of different models or reasons as to why people are attracted to or participate in fandom. Not to say that they're mutually exclusive, because they're probably not.
Right.
But, you know, we've talked about, people are drawn to fandom and fan creation due to a lack of representation. We've talked a lot about that piece about fan fiction as play. So this idea that it's just, you know, a thing that's fun that you do. It can be part of like community building. And then we've talked about fan fiction as a way of making sense of a canon. So you have canons with contradictions in it, and fans do a lot of labor to like make everything in the world make sense. This idea of post-object fandom and fan creation as a result of that is the idea of like the thing that you love is over. So true for Hannibal. But,
yeah. Well, maybe, but yes, for now.
Yeah. And because of the sort of parasocial relationships you've developed around the show and the characters, right, it's very painful to just be like, I'm leaving this world. I have to say goodbye to these people. And so fan creation post the completion of an object or the potential completion of an object is a way to continue to interact with the world and remain in the world and those characters to like continue to be alive.
Right. And that certainly in my mind seems to be the case here, since we've got people basically just continuing the show. Yeah. The show can't end if you keep writing it.
So we didn't pull anything again specific about this. It's just as we're continuing, I think, to also build ideas of like, why do people participate in transformative fandom? This seems to be a reason, and this does seem to be an example of where that is happening. I think a lot of the activity in post-object fandom in the literature that talks about it is also around calls for revivals and calls for the show to continue. And obviously that's picked up in the last several years as like the proliferation of content creators has happened.
Right.
There's more people. I mean, there's just been a ton of revivals.
Right. Yeah. It was a thing that people talked about. It happened on this show. There was a social media movement when this show ended in 2015 or whatever called hashtag Let Hannibal Live, I believe. That was a fan and the like creators were involved with it too, movement to try to get this show picked up elsewhere, which didn't end up happening at the time, but has in the intervening years become very, very common.
So is there anything else we want to cover before we get to the question?
I'll just say we usually talk a little bit about how fans and creators interact. There's not a ton to talk about here because it's really not, in my mind, an adversarial relationship in any way. Brian Fuller is on Twitter all the time talking to the fans about this. Mads and Hugh both talk to the fans. It seems like a pretty uh, friendly, loving environment where they're all Team Hannigram. Everyone's loving it. People want the show picked up. It seems pretty like happy and relaxed, which is a nice fan creator interaction, I think.
Yeah. So, are we ready? Are we ready for the question?
I'm ready.
Maddie?
Ask me the question. Ask me the
Okay.
question.
Is it queer baiting, queer coding, or queer canon?
I gotta go with queer canon. This shit is queer canon. They're telling me Hannibal is in love with Will. They're maybe not explicitly telling me if Will is in love with Hannibal, but it's like some queer relationship, right? Like, this definitely, they're not telling me it's straight. They're not trying to pretend that that's what's happening. I think you could probably get, you're right, that the fact that Brian Fuller is potentially like more explicitly excited about Hannigram on Twitter than he is in official interviews, and the fact that we haven't like seen them make out or whatever in the show, leaves open the possibility of accusations of queer baiting. And there may or may not be some, like, it may or may not be fair to accuse him of not putting enough gay stuff in the show. But I don't think it's, I myself can't avoid it being queer canon when they're literally telling me that Hannibal's in love with Will on the show. What about you? What's your view?
So, I mean, I think it's certainly clear that Hannibal is queer, right? Because Hannibal's in love with Will.
Right?
I guess the question of like, is Hannigram as a relationship? Because there's still so much ambiguity on the Will end of things.
Yeah.
Is that canon or
Well, hard to say. Could be unrequited.
Right. Right. Which I mean is fine. You can tell a story of unrequited.
And it's still canon. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So I guess I only mean like, what are we saying is canon and what are we saying is,
I'm saying
Brian Fuller on Twitter being like, yeah, Hannigram's real, but I'm not gonna put it in the show.
Sure. I don't know. Like, Will did choose to plunge to his death with Hannibal in the end. What he's saying with that move, hard to say.
So I don't know. I think there's a lot of like ambiguity going on, which seems part and parcel with the show. But yeah, Hannibal seems pretty queer.
Yeah. Yeah, can't avoid that. But you're right. I don't think that we have gotten an answer, and I also don't think that Brian Fuller has decided what the extent of their relationship will be if and when we see them on screen together again. Because obviously, at this point in the show, it's not like they're secretly in a relationship, right? Like, we've seen all of their interactions with each other. At this point, Will knows Hannibal's in love with him. Will has made the choices he's made to go, like, be with Hannibal in the way that he has been with Hannibal in the culmination of their murder fantasy. So it's like, at this point, they would either get together or not, I guess, if they lived.
Right. I think something would hopefully have to be resolved at that point, and they wouldn't just pop up out of the water and be like, refreshed. Okay, goodbye.
Let's go our separate ways. So I guess hopefully we'll get season 4 and then we'll really get the answers.
We'll find out. We'll have to revisit this question if season 4 happens. I mean, we can do the gender swap test. What do you think about that? It's a kind of an interesting question too, in light of like.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like they're telling such an explicitly queer story that kind of like takes something out of it. Yeah. If you gender swapped one of the characters, especially when you get into Silence of the Lambs and like there already having been a Hannibal and a Clarice, and him talking about them both sort of being queer coded in their own story. That's an interesting question. But see, in my mind, since they're canon, it's not like they're being kept apart by the fact that they're both dudes.
Yeah, I agree.
But I don't think we have to talk about why it isn't canon.
No, I think we got a lot from, our creators about their thought process with the relationships.
It's all out there. So, I think that's our Hannibal discussion.
Yeah.
It was a fun little experiment. I was happy to hear from you what you thought of the piecemeal show that I had you watch.
I think I got the gist of at least their relationship, if not necessarily the whole show.
Yeah. I think you did too. I guess I'll do my bi-weekly check-in. Are you feeling any more interest in fan fiction?
I can't say that I am. No.
Yeah. We still have not hit the sweet spot of what I'm envisioning being a thing that would interest you in reading fan fiction.
Right. So something happened, Maddie, right?
Something wild, unexpected. We've been asking for it.
We got a letter or an email
From the lovely Elizabeth Case, who said, "Hey, podcast creators." Hey, that's us.
Yeah.
Recently got into your podcast and had a suggestion. Since you mentioned the difference between movie and television fandoms, I thought we might talk about one that has both. Star Trek? I think it fits, especially considering one of the first Star Trek reboot movies was made in 2009, as all the best queer baits are. Keep making the podcast. Really love it. Yours truly, a truly queer baited person.
Well, we have good news.
Yes.
We do have plans to talk about Star Trek. It's going to be, I think, quite a bit later in the run at this point.
Yeah, we have to do it justice, you know?
Yes.
It's like the queer ship that created all queer ships, man. It's Kirk Spock. Kirk Spock is so important.
So, yeah, watch out for that one. It's going to be a little while at this point, but we are going to get to it. We did get a nice follow-up as well, because we sent a note back being like, hey, if you or, again, anyone out in listener land has any suggestions, write us, let us know. And Elizabeth wrote us back to suggest that we cover Riddler and Penguin from Gotham.
Which I'm delighted to have as a suggestion, because I truly did not even know about that ship. Yeah. I didn't watch Gotham. I don't think you did either, but we are always open to suggestions.
We are. So yeah, it may be the case if you write us a suggestion that we're going to cover it, and we'll let you all know. It might be the case that we haven't thought of it. So send us suggestions, and we just have to do a little research. Maybe watch a little Gotham.
It's exciting. The world is our oyster. But thank you, Elizabeth, and hope to hear from the rest of you soon.
Yep. Keep writing us letters. It was just so exciting to receive it. We were thrilled.
What are we doing next week?
Ooh, we are tackling, I think, one of the big ones, one of the big boys.
in the field of queer baiting.
Yes. We will be talking about the BBC show Sherlock, and specifically John Locke, so Sherlock and John Watson.
Should be interesting.
It's going to be an interesting discussion.
I don't know how much people know about the fan-creator interaction on that show, but it is interesting. It's unconventional.
Different.
It's wild.
From this one.
Very much so.
For sure. Maddie, what if in the interim people want to get in touch with us? What if they have thoughts about our Hannibal discussion?
Please get in touch with us in the interim. We want to hear your thoughts. And you can reach us at ltbkpod@gmail.com, or you can find us on Twitter and Tumblr at ltbkpod. Let the Boys Kiss comes out every other Friday at 6 o'clock Eastern, wherever you get your podcasts.